There's this question in the air, right? When is it gonna happen? When is it gonna go down? Over the last decade, especially over the last 12 months, it seems as if public life in the imperial core, in the United States especially, has become entirely untenable. Many of us are, I think, in an ongoing state of disbelief that the proverbial powder keg hasn't blown already, that this is all still largely intact. And to be honest, there's a lot of explanations for why that is, for why the societal stasis we're currently living through seems to be so persistent, but I want to talk about one in particular. And it's probably not the first that comes to mind for almost anyone who thinks about these things seriously. What I want to talk about, what I believe we need to talk about, is consumerism. I don't mean to imply that no one is talking about this. There are, in fact, a few different critiques of consumerism floating around at the moment. Some are better and some are worse, but they're all, in my mind, lacking. That's not to say they're all worthless. In fact, I do think some of them have relevant, important things to say, but none of them get at what I see as the true poison of consumerism, which is the way that it functions as a deep-rooted cultural barrier to building collective political power that could have the potential to actually change the status quo we seem to find ourselves stuck in. The reality is that consumerism is a cornerstone of modern mainstream society, and as such, if we seek to engage the masses and change society, we must properly understand the challenge that it poses. To start out, let's briefly talk about what consumerism or consumer culture even is, and go over a few of the more common critiques you might have already come across in conversation. To put it as simply as possible, consumerism is a cultural phenomenon where people view the purchase of consumer goods and services as a core part, often the very center of their own identity, well-being, and self-actualization. To be clear, this does not merely mean purchasing things that you need to sustain yourself and have a decent standard of living, but rather that the purchase of things is in and of itself seen as desirable or implicitly required in order to take part in mainstream culture. People are conditioned to personally identify with products and brands and the act of consumption in an abstract sense, and most of this is entirely subconscious. In the same way that fish swimming in a river don't know what water is, most people don't recognize the consumerism all around them because of the extent to which it has really, truly, fully at this point, merged with genuine mainstream culture. This shows up in a lot of ways, some more obvious and others less. For example, the cultural divide over iPhone versus Android, the annual debate over whether the Starbucks holiday cup is oppressing Christians enough or not. The level to which art, especially movies and shows at this point, are being clearly made as products first to garner attention and improve the relevancy of a brand, and only secondly, if at all, as genuine art. The cult of celebrity and hero worship around basically any public figure of any kind, the never-ending spectacle of professional sports, where we watch teams owned exclusively by the ultra-wealthy compete against one another for profit and let ourselves believe that they represent us in any meaningful way. This list of examples could be endless, and it's not to say that all of these things are entirely fake or lacking any authentic humanity. Again, consumerism and mainstream culture have largely merged at this point. There's a bit of both manufactured and genuine human interest in all of these examples. The point, though, is that all of them, and truly mainstream culture at this point, are centered around consumer choices. None of these examples, these bits of culture, exist in their current form without the foundational element of people giving their money to, almost always, large corporations in exchange for goods and services. One of the most obvious ways this kind of culture is perpetuated, of course, is marketing. Most people still think of marketing in a classical sense, as easily identifiable messaging, merely convincing people to buy one product or another. But today, much like consumerism itself, marketing is all around us. And at a macro level in society, its main function is just to normalize this kind of culture. to convince people that buying things, consuming goods and services, is the main way for them to express themselves and participate in society. And I think this is pretty obvious when you look at how often explicit advertisements don't actually say anything at all about the thing they're advertising for. Personally, in my own experience, I noticed this the most obviously in car commercials, where you'll watch a whole ad and it won't tell you anything concrete about why you should buy the car. It'll just create a vibe, paint a picture of who you could be if you bought that car. Because they know that in consumer culture, the important thing isn't the utility, the material advantages or disadvantages of what you're buying. It's what the purchase says about you as a person. This cultural mindset is necessary for capitalists to manufacture demand and facilitate the incessant economic growth required by capitalism. So to cut to the chase, this phenomenon is bad, and there are already a few pretty common critiques of it floating around. Let's quickly go through a few of them right now in order from worst to best as I see them. First, we have some critiques that are actually actively regressive, usually based in some sort of religious or spiritual ideology, which tell people that they just shouldn't care about the material world as much as their spiritual well-being, or very often their relationship with God. Now, while it's obviously good to encourage people to not base their emotional well-being entirely on material possessions, these kinds of critiques usually go further and actually encourage people to just ignore their material conditions, including injustices and inequities taking place around them, because all that matters is appealing to the ephemeral, moving target of whatever cult happens to be spinning this kind of rhetoric that day of the week. Basically, if money can't buy happiness, then does it really matter how much anyone has or doesn't have? Just give us your money. That's how you'll find peace. So next up, there's what I would think of as a less toxic cousin of that first critique, which does actually have some valuable things to say. It's similar in painting consumerism as a kind of individual personal malady, but instead of appealing to religious or spiritual ideas, it's more grounded and appeals to the actual, very real effects to mental and emotional health that come when people base all their self-worth on their ability to keep buying more and more stuff, rather than on things like having friends and hobbies and a sense of self that isn't wholly based in what kind of things they like to buy. The message here isn't so much that you shouldn't care about the material world, but rather that you should be wary of the negative effects that come from advertising constantly telling you you're not enough and that you need to buy things in order to be enough. Finally, I think the best critique that you'll sometimes hear is based around the environmental impacts of consumerism. Both the climate impact from the production and transportation of goods, as well as the waste produced at the end of the product life cycle. Both of these are inherent parts of consumerism and capitalism, as companies keep producing more and more goods in their quest for never-ending sales and infinite growth. They help justify this never-ending production by promoting consumerism, manufacturing demand well beyond the point of actual need, and the environment and climate can only sustain so much. This critique is important and necessary, and honestly, we should probably hear a lot more of it. My only real problem with it is that, unfortunately, much like the last one, it's also very easily co-opted by individualistic messaging. In this case, about fighting climate change by making the right choices as a consumer. And while being aware of your climate impact, trying to minimize it and consume less where you're able is canonically a good thing that you should do, it's also not enough. At a big picture level, it's not an effective strategy for meeting the moment when it comes to climate change. And it's certainly not an effective strategy for opposing capitalism, which is, of course, the underlying system driving climate change and environmental degradation in the first place. The reality is that in order to truly overcome capitalism and environmental catastrophe, we need to build a mass movement of active and engaged participants who are set on moving past the existing power structures of the imperial world forcibly when necessary. And this is the main thing I want to talk about in this video. The main thing I want to add to the conversation that I believe has been obviously, glaringly absent. We need to talk about the way that consumerism affects not just individual mental health or even the environment at large. No, the real problem we must grapple with at this point is how consumerism has fundamentally changed the way that people understand their place in society, how it has disempowered and pacified the masses, and how it stands in the way of building meaningful collective power that could actually address the root of the problem. To really understand what I'm wanting to get at here, we need to briefly look at some history and also, at a baseline level, understand that there are different possible ways for people to understand their own identity and their place in society at large. Consumerism might be the default today, but that's not always been the case. Historically, the rise of consumerism was directly tied to the Industrial Revolution and the rise of consumer credit systems. As capitalism pushed the limits of human productive capacity to new levels, capitalists needed to find ways to convince people to keep buying new stuff that they didn't really need. Over the course of many decades, this eventually turned into the consumer culture we know today. But believe it or not, prior to this, people still had a sense of self and thoughts about what they wanted to do with their lives. Those thoughts were just much more commonly rooted in far more active things, like their power as workers or their place in different communities. And this transition from people thinking of themselves primarily as workers or community members to instead basing their identity first and foremost in their passive choices as consumers is, I believe, one of the main things holding capitalist society in place, even as it seems that it is, in many ways, about to crumble around us. There are a few specific pieces to this, but the biggest overarching one is that consumerism today compels people to identify not with the way that they themselves can and do impact the world around them, but rather with their ability to curate their experience of a world that is created for them. To put it another way, it emphasizes people's passive role as consumers as a means of obscuring their agency as productive and autonomous members of society. This has made it incredibly difficult to organize with the masses generally, because most of them have been convinced that the only real say they have in society is an extremely passive one. Most people's idea of what engaging in politics even looks like has been reduced effectively to a series of consumer choices. What nonprofits or groups will you donate to ease your conscience in these troubled times? Which of the two viable candidates in this election will you choose to root for from the sidelines? Which billion-dollar mainstream media outlet do you subscribe to tell you what to think about things? All of these choices require little to no actual action from regular people, instead keeping all of the agency in the hands of the bourgeoisie and their collaborators. Politics in this model is, for most people, just another product. A sport to be viewed from the sidelines, but not meaningfully participated in. This is easy because it's how consumerism teaches us to engage with everything. I would even go so far as to argue that protests at this point, historically a pretty active form of political participation, have, for most people in the mainstream, become less active. Less an attempt to actually directly affect change and more of a social activity, intended to signal something about your identity and perhaps provide some personal emotional relief in the process. Now, to be clear, I don't mean this is the case for all protesting. There's a pretty common saying that in order to be effective, a protest needs to be understood as a threat. And in recent years, there have been some truly great targeted disruptions that definitely meet this criteria, but the reality is that these kinds of actions stand out because they're not the norm. For actions closer to the mainstream, the norm is that most people show up having no real intention of doing anything beyond marching and chanting and calling it a day. And the actions themselves are organized with this understanding. Less of a threat and more of a parade. A production being put on by the organizers to be consumed by the majority of participants in a relatively passive fashion. That isn't to say that these kinds of protests are necessarily bad in a vacuum. It's just to highlight that this is what political engagement has been reduced to for most people. A personal lifestyle choice focused inward at the individual rather than outward at society itself. We can see this same pattern reflected more broadly in the perpetual commodification of counterculture by the mainstream. Countercultures, by definition, are opposed to the dominant cultural themes in mainstream society, one of those themes being consumerism. As such, true counterculture can only be joined through active participation in a community that opposes the mainstream in substantive ways. But as soon as any counterculture starts to have too much success in that aim, it runs the risk of generating its own kind of mainstream appeal and being subsumed into consumer culture, where everything, including group identity, can be bought and sold. The debate over who's a poser or not might be heated within a given subculture, but from the outside, it's largely irrelevant. The posers don't care that they're posers, and the mainstream at large doesn't care to differentiate. The societal baseline established by consumer culture doesn't account for anything outside the realm of consumer choices. Why would you go actively participate in a culture when you could just buy the shirt from a social media ad instead? They're both just status signals, and one is far more convenient. This is the intersection of liberal individualism with the commodification of everything. As Marx described in The Poverty of Philosophy, this is the time when the very things which till then had been communicated but never exchanged, given but never sold, acquired but never bought, virtue, love, conviction, knowledge, conscience, etc., when everything, in short, passed into commerce. It is the time of general corruption, the time when everything, moral or physical, is brought to the market to be assessed at its truest value. Consumer culture arises when this commodification of everything is not seen as a corruption of the intrinsic communal nature of humanity, but rather as a means of individual liberation. Culture isn't being erased as it's subsumed by the free market, it's just being opened up to consumers, who are now more free than ever to be whatever they want to be, so long as they can afford it. Any concerns about the morality of how things are produced or the cultural context surrounding their consumption are secondary to the right of consumers to consume those things. The popular saying that there is no ethical consumption under capitalism is telling here. Well, on a surface level, it postures as a critique of the capitalist mode of production. When you pull back that surface level veneer, it clearly only functions to reinforce it, putting the ethics of production and the question of our own involvement in the systems we consume things from beyond critique entirely. The message underlying that statement is never meant to be that we should stop consuming things which we know to be unethically produced, but rather that the immorality is assumed and ultimately immaterial when weighed against the rights of consumers. This is the entire reason that boycotts are a notable occurrence at all, because the baseline assumption under capitalism is that consumers will consume things without any real regard for how they're produced in the first place, beyond whether or not it makes them cheaper at the checkout line. And this is kind of psychotic when you think about it, right? If you were to put the conditions of production directly in front of the consumers and ask them whether they still want to buy their chocolate, if it means children will be enslaved to produce it, or whether they want to buy that new smartphone, if it means that people are going to die mining the necessary materials, they've got to look those people in the eyes and make that decision, fully knowing the real human impact, then of course anyone who says, yeah, do it, feed a couple of that kid's fingers into the meat grinder so I can have cheaper pork or whatever, well, that person is a psychopath, right? But in the context of capitalism and consumerism, these kinds of things are just expected to some degree or another. And people will, of course, argue that they don't have a choice. Again, no ethical consumption under capitalism. But I think what people really mean when they say this is just that they don't want to have to think about it. It can, of course, be challenging at times to navigate the ethics of consumption in a capitalist society, but it's also very possible to at least try to make informed choices to lessen or mitigate the harm that is often involved in consuming things. For most people in the mainstream, though, they've been told all their lives that they just shouldn't have to worry about it. They have an inalienable right to consume whatever option is most convenient for them. This is the second way that consumerism makes it difficult to organize with the masses. It promotes the idea that any sort of progressive societal movement must not impact the experience of consumers. It must effectively prove itself on the mythical free market, which effectively takes any sort of true revolutionary collective action off the table entirely. If the masses generally won't even rise to the point of making more ethical consumer choices unless they're the most convenient option anyway, then organizing them to oppose the capitalist mode of production entirely in more active ways can feel all but impossible. There's another popular saying in the US that people don't think of themselves as poor, but rather as temporarily embarrassed millionaires. This is usually meant to explain why poor conservative people vote against their own self-interest, as if they're deluded and truly believe that they could make it big and become ultra wealthy at any moment. And personally, I kind of think this take sucks. I think it's a bit elitist and smug, and also just not what is actually going on. People know that they're not millionaires, that they're not going to become one overnight, but they also haven't been given any lens to understand their place in society beyond that of being a consumer. From that extremely limited perspective, the difference between a billionaire and the working poor has nothing to do with their relation to the mode of production or their place in society, the amount of political power they are or aren't afforded. Instead, the difference is reduced to merely the amount of spending power they have. It isn't qualitative, it's just quantitative. Working people who have been taken in by consumerism don't recognize that they do have fundamentally different class interests than the bourgeoisie. This means that consumerism not only limits the types of political engagement that the masses can imagine themselves participating in, it also sets the parameters for what kinds of things they will organize around, focusing generally on efforts that might have the potential to lift individuals higher up the consumer ladder rather than on things which would challenge the systemic hierarchy of the ladder itself. The problem is that the only thing which is ever going to move us past this moment in history in a positive direction is to meaningfully engage in class struggle. And in order to do that, we need to activate and engage the masses. And in order to do that, we need the masses to develop class consciousness. And that is where consumerism stands in the way. As long as people continue to conceptualize themselves first and foremost as consumers looking to benefit from capitalism, it is going to be incredibly difficult to get them off the sidelines and organizing for anything truly radical. To revisit the question that we started this video out with, the reality is that it isn't going to happen so long as most people are waiting for someone else to do it. Someone else to start the movement, to tell them about the certified group of professional revolutionaries that they can donate to change the world, to get us out of this mess. The reality is, of course, that such a group does not exist. That group, if it is ever to exist, is just going to be all of us engaging with society not as isolated consumers, but rather together in active ways. Things like mutual aid, direct action, showing up in person to pressure those in power, organizing your workplace, organizing your apartment building, developing community defense strategies. As more and more of us start to show up, more and more options will become available for us to actively forge our own path and shape our own future. There are a lot of things making it difficult to organize for revolutionary change at this moment in history. Capital is consolidating and gutting the working class at an ever-accelerating rate. The thin veneer of democracy in the imperial core is thinner than ever before, and police and military budgets continue to climb as outright fascists are empowered and emboldened. It might seem like consumerism is small potatoes. What does it matter if people are too invested in buying new stuff, if that's the main way they find fulfillment in their lives or engage with politics? Aren't there bigger issues to tackle? Well, in one sense, yes, there are, but in another sense, no. The reality is that those of us who are trying to tackle those bigger issues right now by doing anything beyond voting and donating are a tiny minority of the general population. And until we find a way to get a lot more people involved, truly, actively involved, we are always going to be on the back foot, fighting an uphill battle. For this reason, one of our most urgent tasks at this point in history must be to activate the masses. And in order to do that, we must understand where they currently are. Consumerism is not the only reason that the masses are unengaged, isolated, and passive, but it is certainly one of the biggest ones. And as such, we must do our best to confront it seriously. Personally, though, I think there's reason to believe that we may be at an inflection point. Over the past decade, it's become harder and harder to ignore the fact that the world seems to be very quickly going sour. More and more of us are asking questions that the mainstream doesn't have answers for. When we've pursued all of the passive means of engagement we've been conditioned to find comfortable, when we've realized that cheering for the blue team over the red team isn't actually doing anything, there's an opening, a chance for activation. And this is where more and more of us are breaking away. We're finding ways to engage actively and truly exercise our agency in society. To peel back the spell of individualism and consumerism, slowly we are all coming to understand that politics is not just a production put on by the few for the many of us to merely consume. Rather, it is produced by all of us, all the time, everywhere. We are coming to understand that we are not going to buy our way to a better world. Instead, we are all going to go outside and create one together. Hey y'all, thanks so much for watching. If you made it all the way to the end here, please like, comment, subscribe, share, all of those things. If you can't think of anything to comment, then just go leave like a gift box emoji so I know who actually did make it to the end. And also, I do have a Patreon at a link in the description. If you're able to pitch in even like a couple of bucks over there, it really means a lot. As you can see, this channel is still very, very small. I don't yet even qualify to make ad revenue off of any of these videos. So yeah, any level or way that you can support me really would mean a lot. I have more videos in the queue that I would like to make in the future. If you have anything you think I should talk about or you'd like to hear me talk about, then please give me those suggestions. And if you're looking for something else to watch from me immediately, I'd recommend going to my channel and finding the video that I posted right before this one. It got pretty severely repressed by the algorithm for reasons that I think will become clear when you see the subject matter. But I feel like it was a pretty good video, and I'd love for more people to see it. Anyway, thanks again for watching. I'll see y'all next time.